Today's episode is just a field study, and we're going to be talking about the grand old Blenkinsopp Colliery that's situated just outside of Haltwhistle in Northumberland. Like I say, it's just a field study as a prelude to doing a proper history. We've got bags of stuff, historical stuff, to do a decent history, but we're looking for some more information as well. I know David Wardle said he was going to help us, and I know some of you people that will be watching this will have worked at Blenkinsopp, and perhaps you can give us some information on the more modern colliery. But Blenky goes back a long way, and the first records, as I've said, that I've got is 1771, and it goes previous to that, a long time previous to that. Now Blenkinsopp didn't work all the time, if you know what I mean. It was laid in, closed for certain times, and had different locations. And what we're going to be looking at today, even for some of the lads that worked at Blenky, you mightn't be as familiar to it, so you're going to learn, you're going to see parts of Blenkinsopp that perhaps you didn't know existed before. But I do apologise for some of the quality of the video. As per usual, I forget certain things when I take them out, so a lot of this video is done on the mobile phone. And I know a lot of people say that the phones these days you can do fantastic videos on. Yeah, they're good, but they're nowhere near as good as a proper video camera. And stood outside there as I was up on the hills, it sometimes struggles to cope with the light, the changes in light and the contrast, so there's a bit of flicker. I apologise for that, but please just look at the content rather than the video quality in this particular instance, and we will be coming back and doing a proper job. So we're going to have a look into the history of the pit to a certain extent, show you around the different areas, and quite a bit of background history, and I'll look a little bit deeper. So I do really hope you enjoy this, because Blenkinsopp is an important colliery in not just the history of Northumberland, but also in the British Isles. I mean, it's just a small provincial pit on the outskirts of the kingdom, if you know what I mean, up in Haltwhistle, there near the Roman wall. And it goes way back, as I said, Blenkinsopp, the name, the De Blenkensopps. As far as I know, they came across with Billy in 1066 or not long after, and were granted lands up there in the Roman wall, the debatable lands, to keep the Sassenachs out. So that's where the history of the name kind of comes from. But when we come into more of our modern period, and the Alan Wardle taking it over and running it for so long, and then Budge buying it. Now RJB, Richard Budge, it was the first pit that he bought before he took over what used to be UK Coal. And as far as I know, it was the first private colliery before denationalisation to employ proper power loading underground, when they introduced shearer faces, 100-yard retreat shearer faces. Now as far as I know, Blenkinsopp was the first privately owned mine in this country to do that. And it closed, was it 2001? Thereabouts. So it had a long lifespan, as I say. It opened, it closed, it opened and it closed. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this, and if you've anything to put in that you can give us information, please do. Where we are is the site of the Castle Drift that a lot of people will associate readily with Blenkinsopp Colliery. Many of you probably worked here. And the date stone's a little bit overgrown on the top there, 1842. But Blenkinsopp goes back a long way. The first official sort of report I've got is 1771, into the sinking of the Deep Pit, or the old John Pit, which is right up on the hills, which shows how far it was in 1771. So it dates back a long way. I know many will say, yeah, it was the monks, but maybe it wasn't. I know Nick Broomhead's looked into this quite a lot, and who was actually at Lanarkos Priory, and the people there weren't really the sort that were going to get their hands dirty, but they possibly had a part to play. So we're going to have a look round, find little bits of it as a taster for you, as I said, and some of this stuff may be new to some of you, and it might stimulate some more information. But anyway, the 1842 drift goes right back to when the Blenkinsopp Company had it, and I think it's Crowhall and Wilson. They certainly had it later when they went bankrupt and relinquished the lease in 1860. But I really got interested in the place because of Lord Carlisle and then James Thompson. The Carlisles leased Blenkinsopp Colliery in 1814 for a period of 21 years. And a lot of the stuff we're going to look at today is part and parcel of where they were working. Now, where the original drift was a water level down near the Tipholt, which is probably now totally obliterated with a railway line and the new road. But many of you that worked at Blenkinsopp perhaps remember when you went down the drift, maybe it's 100 yards or so, you could see an old road coming across. Well, that was driven by Lord Carlisle when James Thompson was the manager in the 1820s, and that was his main horse road. But before that, they were working up on the hill from a drift. I haven't got a clue, it's totally obliterated now. It's down at the front near where the college was. But we'll have a bit of a route round and see what we can find. And according to the old plans, Thompson's drift, his horse drift, was down by the main road. But I've never been able to find it yet. Never mind. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, does it? Now this gully looks quite promising. It seems to be running in the right direction. But it could just be a load of stuff that's been heaped up. I don't know. Anyway, Thompson's drift down here, this horse level, was driven in the early 1820s. The pit was drained by a series of water levels that came out in the River Tipholt down there. And by the 1820s, they were running out of coal. Now, the great John Buddle came to do a survey on the pit for the Blenkinsopp Coulsons, because this land and these mineral rights belonged to the Blenkinsopp Coulsons then. And what Buddle sort of came up with was that the old water level, well actually the old water level was situated further east. The water level they were then using, called the Folly Pit Mothergate, had crept up from being truly water level, which meant that the shafts that Thompson was working, he wasn't working this drift then, he was working through shafts we're going to have a look at up on the top there. But they'd hit a major fault, the upper Denton fault, and they were running out of coal. And Buddle said because the water level hadn't been kept up level, it had crept up to the rise, a lot of coal had been sterilised down to the dip. So Thompson then was left, as Lord Carlisle's manager, in a bit of a quandary what to do, whether to develop, how much money to spend to develop the pit again, because they only by that time had about 10-12 years left on the lease. So this, following Buddle's advice, this drift was driven as a horse drift and also as a new water level. And they brought the coal out of here with horses on bogies. They'd be carvers, wouldn't they, I suppose. So, but we have a good explanation of what was going on in here. And this was then the pit top. And Thompson was eager to keep hold of the pit to renew the lease for Lord Carlisle because of the coming railway. He knew it was going to be valuable. But sadly, they didn't get the lease again, and the new Blenkinsopp company took over, which I think was possibly Crowhall and Wilson. But the way that the Thompsons left it meant that the new company had to spend a lot of money on development, and they sunk the Smallburn number 1 shaft, Blenkinsopp number 1 shaft, the quarry pit, of which there is a painting. People think that painting's Blenkinsopp number 1. It isn't. It's a quarry pit. And they also drove the Castle Drift in 1842. But by 1860, they were bankrupt. They were well on the way to bankruptcy by 1854 as well. Anyway, we'll go have a walk up the old bridleway onto the top. We'll show you some of these old shafts. Now we've come up the Pennine Way, where it meets the old road, the old pit road and the old lime kiln road. So this is dead easy to find. See that tree behind me? The road down to the A69's here, the Pennine Way. And we're near the old tile sheds, and Heb's super duper GPS pinpointed the tile sheds here. Now if you wander over to that tree, there's an old shaft there, and you can have an idea where the old wind gin was there, the horse gin was and everything. Now I don't know anything about the history of that shaft. It's possibly before James Thompson and Lord Carlisle came up here. There's a line, according to John Buddle when he did his survey in 1821, bearing in mind there'd be a lot more visible in 1821, he said there was a line of old pits right down the fell that you could see that traced the line of the Folly Pit Mothergate. Now a lot of them will have grown over today, so this probably predates, as I said, 1814. We're going to have a wander up to where Thompson was, which is going towards Gap Shields. But first of all, behind the tree, I don't know if you can pick it out, but right above the shaft there is a radio mast. And it's 30 years since I've been there, but that is where the old John pit was, or the deep pit, which we have records going back to 1771. So we'll have a horse over there and see if we can see that. But we'll have a look at this shaft first. This is where the shaft was, obviously it's all collapsed in now. It looks like where I'm stood is a solid area where possibly the coal was landed. And on the other side of the shaft, I say possibly, is where they had the horse gin. It's hard to 100% work out. The horse gin could have been there even. But anyway, this is one of the old shafts just next to the tree. But like I say, there's not much to see now, is there? Who needs the drone up to see it properly? This is probably where the gin was. We've got the main road coming across here, and the tile sheds are just on the other side, you say, Ian?
Just from there, yeah.
So there should be a shaft in this field here then, the new shaft in this field. So the tree's the location point, and it looks like there's been a bit of a track up there.
Yeah, I mean, I've got my GPS on, and it's actually putting the dot on the
Here.
old maps. And
For the tile sheds here. There's a bit of a track running in that field there, so is that what's known as the new shaft, and that was 14 fathoms. And the rest of the tile sheds were just further up here, are they?
from there, right?
Yeah.
I think the old shaft's more this way.
Yeah. You can see there's been a possible track leading away, but that down there is where the tile sheds were, and that's where they made terracotta. Well, I say terracotta, probably not terracotta. They made tiles and earthenware pipes, and there's quite a few remains. You know, you can see very clearly where it was, although it looks like the field in front where perhaps the clay works was being excavated. Anyway, we'll try and find where the John pit was and have a wander across and look at that. You can see where we've come from, the tree in the background there, and we're now near the radio mast. And it's working theories. We've got a lot more work to do on this. Where we are now, I'm sure this is one of the old shafts, although it doesn't look as defined as it did 30 years ago. Now, the report from 1771 talks about the deep pit, which was also known as the old John pit, which was then in 1771 the working shaft, and he said it was about just over 700 yards away from the castle. Well, this is well over 700 yards away from the castle, so perhaps it's further that way. But then again, maybe this could be it. And he says that it's 52 fathoms deep, which makes it 312 feet thereabouts. A fathom is 6 foot. And it's thereabouts worked out, and he said that the water level hadn't been kept up, and the old plan does show an old water level. So he set out a new shaft to be sunk 400 and odd yards to the rise. Now, are we 400 and odd yards from that tree? Or are we a lot further? I don't know. So is this the deep pit? And that is the new one that was set out, that was only going to be 40 fathoms deep. But one good thing is it gives us a total costing of everything, the pumps, the gin. He talks about the water level not being kept up truly water level. So we do have a bit of an insight into 1771. And he says that the earliest workings are a lot earlier workings are to the north and northeast of the castle, which is going out towards Rytree, really, isn't it? But here we're at about 700 yards at least southeast of the castle. So you can see how long this pit had been working at the time. So as I say, we're right next to the radio mast, and we need to do a little bit more field work and dissect these old reports before we can say yes, this is definitely. But we might always be on working theories. Mightn't we, Morgan? Now I'm not wanting to make too many sweeping statements up here. I'm 95% sure of some stuff. But I think this is where Alan Wardle and the Wardle connection with Blenkinsopp Colliery started. And he put a drift in here, and I'm sure I've seen a photograph taken here of a tram road going across the bridge, and you can see the abutments on either side down towards the roadside. So I know that photograph's in existence, and if anybody can help us with it, I'd be really grateful. But when the drift was started, they were really taking coal that was the old Blenkinsopp, if you know what I mean, that we've just talked about, where Thompson was. But fast forwarding quite a few years to the 1930s, the Naworth Collieries, they came in and they put a drift in near the old Blenkinsopp to work pillars and a bit of virgin coal near the crop edge that Thompson had left in the 1830s, well, in the 1820s up there, when he hit the Upper Denton Fault. And that drift got known as Gap Shields Drift near Todd Holes, and it was actually nationalised by the Coal Board. And it didn't work very long with the Coal Board to the early 1950s. But when the Wardles, I think Alan Wardle started this drift here, he was then taking coal that Gap Shields Drift had left. And from here, I think it progressed then down to Reopen Castle and Rytree. I'm sure David will tell us far more about it. You can see where the drift was at the top here of the clough, and this is where the bridge was. So this is roughly where Alan's drift was, or it's a fall not so far up the drift, and you can see where the radio mast is up the fell there, where I think perhaps the deep pit was. But I've got a bit of a plan we'll show you here, which I got off my old friend the late John Parker. And John, as you know, well maybe you don't know, wrote an awful lot of history about the Haltwhistle area. John had known a lot of these pits since he was a kid, throwing stones down the shaft at Plenmeller and things like that. But John worked here. John was a mechanic here, a fitter, well certainly at Castle and Rytree for many, many years, as was his son Johnny. And continuing the mining theme there with his son Johnny, Johnny's still working up at Ale, he's a mechanic there as well. So anyway, I'm sure David will tell us a lot more about this particular drift, but here's a bit of a codgy plan of it. Thompson as manager was working the pits up here, and this shaft here, there's at least 4 shafts that's named up here. There's the Gustavus, which I believe to be this shaft. There's Bella, which is the furthest to the south, nearest the fault. Then there was the new John pit, and then the new pit. And I can't find which was the John pit and the new pit. And also, I don't know if you can see them trees in the background over there, but there was a horse level there, a horse drift, because obviously they worked horses underground as well as on the surface on the gins, and they took the horses down that drift. Now, they rented the pit for £700 per year, and also included in that rent was a 54-acre farm, and this is the farmland. When we get up in the air, you'll see a boundary wall to the south. That is actually the colliery farm boundary wall, and to the west you can tell that boundary because the grass on the other side really is greener, and that is the start of the Gilsland barony. So when Lord Carlisle was renting Blenkinsopp Colliery, his lease stopped with that wall over there, and that was actually his land and his coal. Now these shafts here were a lot shallower than where we've just been. I think the Gustavus was around about 24 fathoms, and the Bella something similar, perhaps less. So anyway, we'll get up in the air and I'll show you the basic area. Like I said, we've got a lot more work to do here, researching, so we can maybe be a bit more hard and fast with our facts, but nevertheless have a walk up and see what remains here. Where I'm stood now is where the gin would have been for the Gustavus pit, and you can imagine the activity that was going on up here in the 1820s, from 1814 up to 1820 odd, you know. It must have been marvellous to see. There's quarries as well, you know, and lime kilns, tile sheds up here, and then of course we're going to go across to Gap Shields Fan. So there's a lot of industrial archaeology up here that perhaps you might have noticed before as you've been walking up. Well, as you can tell, we've done this video. I've taken this video over 2 different takes. The day that me and Heb went up over on the Easter Friday, and also another time. So this is just a little bit of a time out, because we're walking around the fields and we're looking at different shafts. And now many can think, well, the pit is there. And the pit is in a specific location. Oh yeah, such and such a pit was at the bottom of Union Street. And in a way, that's right. But the pit is underground. The pit is everywhere. It's not just in that one specific location. And I thought it'd be good to look at some plans of Blenkinsopp so you can actually see what we're really looking at underground. Put it this way. In a previous video I did about training days, I talked about when I used to go across to Apton Valley and meet my dad coming up off the back shift sometime during the school holidays. And you'd be at the top of the drift there waiting for the train to come up the pit, and the train would come up and all these blokes would dive off. But you thought, yeah, where does that train come from? Or the paddy as you call it in some place. What world has my dad just come out of with all these other guys? What is it like down there? Remember the old Shakin' Stevens song, The Green Door? What's that behind the green door? There's an old piano playing it hot behind the green door. Well, a mate of mine, his dad was an overman at Bolden Colliery, and every morning on his way to school he used to walk through the pit yard to get to school, and he said that they used to walk past the upcast airlock. And he used to wonder what was the other side of that door, the other side of that airlock. Hey, being the coal board, it could have actually been a green door. I'll have to ask him. And then he actually got a start at the pit, and that morning he went through the airlock to see this whole new world. And that's what it was like when we first went down the pit. We saw the actual pit, not just those buildings at the top. Now each pit is a living, breathing thing. Believe it or not, they all have their own atmosphere, their own feel to them. Some are wet, some are dry, some smell different. The characters that are in it, they've got their own different names to the roadways. So let's have a look at some old plans, and I've got a couple of old plans to have a look at and give you a bit of an idea what Blenkinsopp looked like underground. Right, so what we've got here. Castle, Blenkinsopp, 1840s and 1820s. Now I love colliery plans. I could sit and look at plans, well, not all day, you know what I mean, but I do, I love them. And every time you look at them, you find something new. So what we're doing outside with them? Well, as anybody that really is into plans knows, some of them are really massive. And there's actually, and the works of art, some of them, they're not on paper, these are obviously photocopies. Usually they're on like, well, they're made out of on a cotton back, really, Hessian back. Beautiful colour, most of them, and some really intricate artwork. Some of them really are works of art, and they're big, well, depending on the size of the pit. But you can get them out and put them all over the living room floor. and then the dog or the cat comes howling in the room right across the plans, and all of a sudden you've got footprints. So here we are outside. So what we got? Well, so far they're all upside down to you, but this is Blenkinsopp in 1820 when we're looking at these shafts, the Bella shaft and everything. And underneath we've got, now that's around about 1840s, the 1840s, just at the Castle Drift. And this one, beautiful plan, the Blenkinsopp Colliery 1860 when Crowhall and Wilson finished looking at, and we've got another one here of the Byron. So I'll set the camera up better so we can get a better view and I can show you what's what. So we'll have a look at this fantastic plan from the 1860s when the Blenkinsopp Colliery Company gave over. And I know I've said they've gone bankrupt, but that's possibly not the case. They were certainly in financial difficulties. Let's bring it into view. This is the Castle Drift, and we're going back to Thompson's old workings. This drift comes to daylight here. Obviously this infrastructure is from the modern Castle Drift, the coke ovens and everything like that. If we just zoom out, now this area bounded here is actually what Thompson came back through this drift. When we're looking at the Bella pit and all that, we're looking up here. This is a colliery boundary farm. They hit the Upper Denton fault up here, but obviously the new company has managed to get a few dip workings up by the side of Thompson's old workings. Now, after Buddle's visit, Thompson put his new horse road in here, and these are his workings. Obviously they're not shown because they're not part of this company, and you can see that's his old water level. And what Thompson did for Lord Carlisle when they came near the end of the lease, they brought the water level up and didn't drain the whole lot. So when the new company came, they had to start afresh. So they started, it looks like, by sinking the Smallburn number 1 shaft and the quarry pit. And as you see, the dip is this way, as those that worked at the castle will know. So, like, the quarry pit is sunk to this level, which meant that all this coal to the rise between there and Thompson's Blenkinsopp workings was then dewatered. The Smallburn shaft, obviously, is sunk even further to the dip, which opens all this area to be dewatered. And below this point, they've obviously used pumps. And the Castle drifters work this by the means of pumps. And you can see they've worked an awful lot of coal in those 21 years. Well, we're going from 1835 to 1860. Well, going on for 25 years then. Quite a long time. And some interesting features we can see up here, because this is obviously going up to the rise, and they've used wheels or some form of mechanical haulage. Are they horse driven? And if you look, they're up here quite early, 1841. So they've worked this rise coal that Thompson left pretty early before they've worked all this deep coal to the dip. And you can see that's interesting, isn't it? Another wheel there and dotted line going down. Obviously showing, well, what is it showing? Is that their haulage road? It could possibly be, couldn't it? Crank pump. It goes straight back to the quarry pit there, doesn't it? So you can learn an awful lot of these plans. And if we look at the furnace pit there, that comes up in the caravan park, or I should say the mobile home park, the park homes. And that furnace pit goes back, it predates Thompson by a long, long way. I think it's part of the old original Blenkinsopp Colliery. So that's part of having a look at some of the plans. There's other things that have been written on. J.M. Clark has taken over this plan, or had use of this plan. Clark's obviously, they're land agents in the Haltwhistle area, but they were very much invested in the coal industry. They became part of the open Thirlwall Colliery in about 1899. They also formed the Colmwood Coal Company after Crowell and Wilson packed in Cornwood. They then became, or as a subsidiary company, they were also the Naworth Coal Company as well. So Clarks were involved in an awful lot in the area, but I don't know what their involvement was possibly in the Blenkinsopp Colliery, or whether they were looking at it as a further investment. I don't know. Anyway, back to the field. Re-examining everything, this then possibly could be the Gustavus, and that one near the tree is one of the old pits off the Folly Pit Mothergate, because like Ian said, this is far more developed. There's a lot more, it's bigger, there's more infrastructure, and if Lord Carlisle was working it, it would be on a bigger scale. And it looks like the Bella pit, we'll have a wander across, is over there. So between the two we should have the John somewhere near the lime kiln. It gets confusing. Like I say, we're getting mixed up with them all a bit, but this is possibly the Bella one. Definitely defined track straight down to the lime kiln. I think Jasper Carrot would love these, wouldn't he? And digging up a fair bit of coal with moles. Well, this is the one nearest the fault. So we're at the top of the pit road and we've got these buildings in here, so this is definitely where Naworth Collieries came, and then the coal board buildings as well. And if we're going to wander across, we're going to wander across there to the Byron fan. That later became Gap Shields Colliery with the McDonald's and them. That's the next port of call, but this was the old NCB pit road. You can just see a tramway embankment in that field near where them sheep are. It looks to be. See the hole in the roof?
Oh, aye.
I wonder if that's where the winding ropes come out. I'm not sure exactly if the shaft was on this bit. So that was possibly the fan house. So this was reworked again. It was the Byron fan, the Byron Colliery. They had a massive steam fan, and then they replaced the fan with the steam fan with an electric fan. They had a telephone up here as well, and this was about a mile in from the Byron Drift. But then it was reopened around about the First War and run as Gap Shields Colliery. And they then drew coal up this shaft. A house on the hill, eh? What's the story behind that? Well, following Lord Carlisle's loss of the Blenkinsopp lease in 1835, Thompson was very concerned because he didn't want to lose the trade in the area, and the railway was coming, and also he didn't want to lose his best hewers to the new company. So what he did for Lord Carlisle, they started the Thirlwall Colliery, or Baron House as it was then known, above Thirlwall Castle, going up to, well, on the other side, going up towards the Roman wall. Well, the other side of the Roman wall actually, and that was in the Thirlwall seam, which is below this Little Limestone seam here. Now, as well as that, he opened up coal on Lord Carlisle's land on the Gilsland Barony around here on the outcrop, and it became known as Gap Shields. And it didn't produce a lot. I think around about the 1840s, the two pits between were only produced about 10,000 tonnes that year. And Thirlwall Baron House didn't last long. So Gap Shields was intermittent, but it was to keep on the best hewers so we didn't lose them, and he kept a foothold on trade. Now, when the Blenkinsopp Company went bust, Lord Carlisle reapplied for, well, then James Thompson had taken over the lease of Lord Carlisle's colliery, so Thompson applied to get the lease, and in 1860 it was granted him. Now, to open up, he had to get to the other side of the Upper Denton Fault that they'd hit in the 1820s, if you remember. So they opened up on two fronts. They started near Angerton, down a little to the west of the old Blenkinsopp Drift, and drove a drift there that became known as the Byron Colliery. And then they started near Tyndall Village, on the opposite side of the main road, and sunk Greenside, or Roachburn as we know, and the plan was to work all the coal between the two. But Roachburn only lasted for about 15 years till they hit the Wind Dyke, which is a large piece of whinstone that runs right through the geology of the area. There's many wind dykes, but a big one that runs through there, which is interesting later on. Now, Byron, to get to the other side of the Denton Fault, where the coal was, had to be driven in solid stone, and it was a mile long was the stone drift, all driven with hammers and jumper drills, basically like a big chisel that you hit, and it took them nearly 6 years to develop the pit that went through very hard stone. Now, so what's the building behind me? That is the fan for Byron Colliery. There used to be another building at the side of it, and it was still there in the 1990s. A light blue, Peter. We've got a photograph we took earlier. Now, that shaft isn't as deep as you think. It was only about 30 yards deep. But believe it or not, in 1888 there was a telephone underground there, connected to the drift entrance at Byron. Now, when Byron Drift got through the fault, round about this shaft here, it then turned down to the full dip. And the full dip was between 1 in 7 and 1 in 10 going south. And it opened up a vast area there. And it ran for nearly 50 years, employing 2, sometimes nearly 300 men. And it ran until the time of the Roachburn disaster. Because Roachburn had reopened around about 1896, it had been sunk, new shaft had been sunk, and they'd sunk it a bit to the dip, and this time they'd got through the Wind Dyke, and Roachburn and Byron met up, and then the disaster came in 1908, which I'm sure most of you know about, where the Tarn broke in and flooded the workings. Well, that stopped Byron as well. But that wasn't the end of the story. In 1909, 2 local men, just a year after the disaster, applied to Lady Carlisle to reopen the shaft here, because not all Byron was flooded. There were quite a considerable amount of pillars that were above the water level, you see. But nothing came of that. Now, in 1914, a man called MacDonald, who had been the manager at the then newly opened Thirlwall, because another company had another go at the old Baron House in a new place, he had been manager there, being Mr. MacDonald, and he applied with his company, the Gap Shields Coal Company, or Colliery Company, to reopen this. And they did. It became known as Gap Shields Colliery, and they worked that shaft. And that
became the winding house, and there is a hole in the roof, and I wonder if that's where the winding rope was. The shaft was between the two buildings, but there's another hole in the roof on the other side. Well, there wasn't a rope going up the other side, and they're connected to a stage by the side of the A69 that you can still see. For a start, it was horse and cart haulage away down to the railway, but that wasn't very good, so they constructed a tramway, and the pit worked on until the mid-1920s, and round about 1920 they abandoned this site and they went down and reopened the Byron Drift and worked the rest of the pillars out the Byron Drift. And at the finish, the manager here was called Dodd, and Dodd then went further and worked more pillars down by Byron and part of the old Castle Drift, some of Thompson's old pillars down there. So we'll go into that later when we explain the history of the pit proper. But it's wonderful that this is still here. Sad that it's not a decent day like it was when me and Heb were here. But just one more thing, Naworth Collieries, as well as when they reopened that Gap Shields drift there, now Todd Holes, they also opened a drift the other side of these trees, the other side of the building there, called Ray Garth. But that didn't last long. Again, they were going into the crop edge and the old workings of the old Gap Shields. So anyway, that's a brief sort of field study of this area, and we're going to put together a proper video, but you can appreciate that it's not going to be a quick and easy job. There's an awful lot to go into this work. So anyway, we're going to put the drone up and show you. You'll see where this building is, and behind there's another shaft you'll be able to see, and that's a ladder shaft, and that wasn't very deep, obviously. That's ladders, and they were using that as an upcast shaft at some point. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the drone footage, and thanks for watching this particular video.